the silent robbery. It was a cold, lonely night at the 24-hour gas station. Kyle had worked the third shift for the past 6 months, and at this hour, everything was always eerily quiet. The buzz of the fluorescent lights above him was the loudest sound in the store. Aside from the occasional hum of the outdated coffee machine, a few late-night drivers had stopped in for gas, but for the most part, it was just Kyle, the neon signs, and the endless hours stretching ahead. It was just past 3 a.m. when the door jingled open. A man stepped in, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap that cast a shadow over his face. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, looking around as if he was deciding whether or not to buy something. Kyle glanced up briefly, nodding in acknowledgement, and then returned to cleaning the counter. The man seemed normal enough, at least at first. A regular customer, maybe. He walked over to the coffee station, filling up a cup, but still, Kyle's gut told him something wasn't quite right. The man turned around, his face hidden under the brim of the cap, and in an instant, everything shifted. Without a word, he pulled something out from under his jacket, a gun. Kyle's blood turned into ice. His eyes locked onto the barrel of the gun, cold and unfeeling. The man's hands were steady, controlled. He didn't shout, didn't demand anything, but the tension in the air was so thick it made Kyle's throat feel like it was closing up. "Open the register," the man said, his voice calm, unnervingly calm. Kyle's mind raced, but his body was frozen. His fingers were shaking as he reached for the register, his thoughts scattered. He had been trained for this moment. But in that instant, all the training felt meaningless. The gun in front of him was real. This wasn't a drill. The register beeped as Kyle punched in the code, but the man didn't take his eyes off him. There was no urgency in his movements, no impatience, just a blank stare that sent a chill down Kyle's spine. "Money," the man repeated. Kyle grabbed the cash and slid it toward him, hands trembling. The man didn't move to take the bills. Instead, he took a step forward, his shoes making a soft thud against the linoleum floor. Kyle could feel the weight of his gaze, could feel the coldness of it, even though his face was mostly obscured by the cap. "You're not going to make this difficult, are you?" the man said, his voice still low and steady. There was no anger, no frustration, just an eerie calm that sent a wave of dread through Kyle's chest. "No," Kyle managed to whisper, his throat dried. Just take it." The man slowly reached for the money, his fingers brushing against Kyle's hand. But then, as his fingers closed around the stack of bills, the lights above flickered. Kyle barely noticed at first, his mind too focused on the gun in front of him. But then, the lights flickered again, and then went out. Complete darkness. Kyle froze, his heart hammered in his chest as his eyes tried to adjust. The usual hum of the store's lights was replaced by silence, thick and oppressive. His breath caught in his throat, his hands still gripping the counter. "Stay still." The man's voice cut through the blackness. Kyle didn't dare move, barely breathing. The seconds stretched into an eternity. It felt like the world outside had stopped, leaving only him and the man standing in that dark store. The air grew thick with tension, and Kyle's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the lights flickered back on, but the man was gone. Kyle's pulse pounded in his ears as he looked around, his gaze darting to the door. The bell hadn't jingled. No footsteps, nothing. The store was empty again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt wrong. The man had vanished without a trace, and Kyle was left alone with nothing but the empty space and the cold, lingering sensation that something was terribly off. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty counter, the register still open. His hand reached out, pulling the drawer shut, almost mechanically. He locked the door behind him, checked the cameras, but there was no sign of the man on any footage. It was as if he had never existed. Kyle's thoughts raced, but one thing was clear. He wasn't sure if he'd just survived a robbery, or something far worse. The door to the gas station had been locked, and yet somehow, the man had disappeared without a sound. And now, in the unsettling silence of the station, Kyle wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the robbery that had almost happened, or the fact that it felt like he was being watched. The silent shadows in Chicago. It was 2:30 a.m. when Miguel Martinez shuffled behind the counter at the corner gas station. The neon lights buzzed outside, casting long shadows across the cracked tile floors. The city of Chicago was always alive in some way, but this stretch of South Side felt eerily quiet in the middle of the night. It was a quiet he was all too familiar with. Miguel had been working the third shift for over a year now. The occasional late-night customer came in for snacks or cigarettes, but more often than not, he was left alone with only the sounds of the flickering overhead lights and the hum of the pumps outside. He had just restocked the cigarette counter when the door chimed, and in walked a man. It was unusual for anyone to come in this late, especially on a weeknight. The man was tall, wearing a long dark coat, and a baseball cap pulled low, hiding most of his face. His eyes were barely visible, but there was something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Miguel barely glanced up at first. He figured it was just another late-night customer, but as the man approached the counter, Miguel noticed something odd. The man wasn't carrying anything. No drinks, no snacks, just staring. "Can I help you?" Miguel asked, forcing a friendly tone, even though his stomach was starting to tighten. The man didn't respond at first. He just stood there, staring at Miguel with a cold, almost empty expression. Miguel shifted uneasily, his fingers brushing the edge of the register, and then, without warning, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a handgun. Miguel's heart stopped. The man's eyes never left him, and his voice was a low, calm whisper. "Give me the money." Miguel's mind raced. He had been trained for this. He knew the procedures. Don't fight back. Don't make any sudden moves. Keep calm. But something in the man's eyes, the coldness, the stillness, sent a chill down his spine that he couldn't shake. He fumbled with the register, his hands shaking so badly that it took him a moment longer than usual to open it. The man's gun remained steady, pointed right at his chest. "Faster," the man hissed. "I don't have all night." Miguel managed to grab the cash, sliding it across the counter with trembling hands. The man took it without a word, still not moving, still watching Miguel like a predator watching its prey. His cold stare never wavered. Miguel's fingers were still on the register when the lights above them flickered, just for a second, long enough to make Miguel's breath catch in his throat. And then, the lights went out completely. The store was plunged into complete darkness. The sound of the neon buzzing outside was suddenly gone, replaced by the deafening silence of the night. Miguel's heart hammered in his chest, and the only thing he could hear now was his own breath and the faint rustling of clothing. He stood there in the dark, his eyes wide, unable to move. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't even hear the man anymore. The terror of the unknown clawed at him, making the hairs on his neck stand up, and then he heard it. Footsteps. Slowly, deliberately, they echoed in the darkness. Getting closer, Miguel's pulse raced as he waited, hoping the lights would come back on, but they didn't. The footsteps stopped just inches from the counter. A cold breath touched his ear. "Don't move," the voice whispered. So close that Miguel felt the words against his skin. Miguel's body locked up. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the light flickered back on. The store returned to its dull, sterile brightness. Miguel blinked, disoriented, but when he looked up, the man was gone. The door was still locked. No bell had rung. Miguel stood frozen for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened. He checked the cameras. Nothing. The security footage showed nothing at all. The man had vanished. It wasn't just the robbery that scared him. It was the way the man had vanished into thin air. The footsteps. The whisper. It felt like something wasn't right. His hands were still shaking when he reached for the phone, calling the police. But deep down, he knew something far more terrifying had happened that night. The man hadn't just taken the money. He had left a part of himself behind. And Miguel wasn't sure if he was ever going to feel safe working that shift again. The watchful eyes. It was another late shift for Alex at the old gas station on the outskirts of town. The place had been around for decades, and it showed. Flickering lights, cracked tiles, and the constant hum of the fridge in the back. It was quiet tonight, too quiet, even for a third shift. Alex's co-workers had warned him about working this shift alone, but bills had to be paid. As the clock ticked past 2 a.m., Alex's eyes began to feel heavy. The only noise came from the occasional car driving past the station, and the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. He poured himself another cup of stale coffee, trying to stay alert. Then, the bell above the door jingled. Alex didn't even look up at first. He just assumed it was another late-night driver grabbing a soda or filling up their tank. But when he heard the soft footfalls approach the counter, he looked up. A man stood there, staring at him. He was tall, thin, and dressed in an old weathered jacket. His hair was wild, and his eyes were wide but unfocused, like he wasn't really looking at Alex, more like he was looking through him. Alex forced a smile. "Can I help you?" The man didn't speak. He just stood there, unmoving, his eyes locked on Alex. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Alex cleared his throat. "Sir?" Finally the man spoke, but his voice was soft, almost too soft, like he was speaking in a whisper, only meant for Alex. "I've been here before." Alex blinked. He tried to recall if he had seen this man in the store before, but he didn't recognize him. "I don't think I've seen you," Alex said. "You need something?" The man continued to stare, his eyes unblinking, unnervingly still. "I've been here before. I've been here." A long time. A shiver ran down Alex's spine. The man's voice, though quiet, seemed to reverberate in his mind, a low echo that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "I'm not sure what you mean," Alex said, his voice a little shaky now. He glanced toward the door, but the parking lot was empty. There were no cars, no other customers in sight. The man leaned a little closer to the counter, his face just inches from Alex's. "I see you every night. I see you all the time." Alex swallowed hard, a cold sweat forming on his brow. He wasn't sure what this man was talking about. He was starting to feel claustrophobic, like the air in the room was thickening. "I don't know what you're talking about," Alex muttered, trying to force the words out. The man's lips curled into a strange, unsettling smile. His eyes, still wide and unblinking, flickered to the corner of the room. He nodded slowly, as if agreeing with some invisible thought. "You think you're alone," the man whispered. "But you're never alone here." Alex's heart skipped a beat. He had worked at this station for months, but now that feeling of isolation, the silence, the emptiness, suddenly it all felt wrong, like something was watching him from the shadows. Before Alex could respond, the man turned and slowly walked toward the door, his footsteps dragging. He didn't look back. "Good night," the man said softly, his voice lingering in the air as he stepped outside. Alex sat frozen for a moment, staring at the door, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. The bell above the door jingled as the man disappeared into the dark night. Minutes passed, then an hour, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the air. The silence was too thick now. The shadows seemed deeper. He tried to focus on the tasks in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to the man and his eerie words. At 4 a.m., the door jingled again. Alex's heart stopped. His eyes snapped to the door, expecting to see the man from earlier, but there was no one there. Just the empty parking lot, the cold wind blowing through the cracked door. He let out a nervous laugh, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But then, as he turned to go back to the counter, something caught his eye. On the security monitor, the man from earlier was standing outside, staring through the window at him. Alex's breath caught in his throat. The man's face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and staring. It was like he hadn't moved, hadn't left. His presence was suffocating. Even from behind the glass, the man didn't move, didn't blink. He just watched. Alex bolted out from behind the counter, grabbed his phone and dialed 911. But by the time the police arrived, there was no trace of the man, no footprints in the snow outside, no sign he had ever been there. But as Alex sat in the empty gas station, trying to make sense of what happened, he saw something on the camera monitors, a faint shadow, standing at the far corner of the lot, still watching. The night shift. It was 2:30 a.m., and Danny was alone at the 24-hour gas station on the edge of town. He'd been working the third shift for nearly a year now. Most nights were uneventful, quiet and boring. A few late-night drivers, the occasional person looking for snacks. But tonight, something felt different. The fluorescent lights flickered above him as he wiped down the counter, staring out the front window into the empty parking lot. He had that nagging feeling, the one you get when you're being watched. It was stupid, but it wouldn't go away. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe just too many late-night horror movies. But the feeling stuck with him. At 3 a.m., the door to the gas station jingled. Danny looked up and saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim streetlights outside. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat, but what caught Danny off guard was how still he stood, completely motionless, just staring in. "Can I help you?" Danny called out, trying to hide the unease in his voice. The man didn't respond. He didn't even move. His face was obscured by the brim of a hat, but his body remained stiff, as if frozen in place. Danny blinked, trying to shake off the creeping discomfort. He gave a nervous chuckle. "You know, it's a little late for standing outside, buddy." The man stepped forward, still silent, and slowly entered the store, his boots making a soft clink as they hit the floor. Danny tensed, instinctively taking a step back. The man didn't speak. He just walked toward the counter, his movements unnaturally smooth. Danny's heart began to pound. Something felt terribly off about this. "You need gas? A drink?" Danny asked, forcing a smile. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached up and removed his hat, revealing a pale face. His skin was almost sickly white, with deep, dark circles under his eyes. But what really made Danny's stomach turn was the smile, the way his lips stretched unnaturally wide, showing rows of yellowed, uneven teeth. Danny froze. Then, the man spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "I've been waiting for you." Danny's blood ran cold, his throat tightened, and he couldn't get the words out. All he could do was stare, as the man slowly leaned forward, his breath cold against Danny's face. You've been waiting for me," Danny stammered. The man nodded, his smile widening impossibly. "Yes," he whispered, "always waiting." Danny's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He'd heard stories. People were always talking about strange happenings at this old gas station, but he never thought any of it was true. Before Danny could react, the man slowly reached out with a long, bony finger, tapping the glass counter between them. The tapping echoed louder than it should have, each soft knock reverberating through Danny's chest. "Don't worry," the man whispered, his voice colder now, like a shadow. "I'm just here to watch." Suddenly, Danny's body surged with panic. He bolted toward the back office, slamming the door behind him and locking it. His breath was ragged, and his hands shook violently as he pulled out his phone, dialing the police. The phone rang once, twice, then a voice on the other end picked up. 911, "What's your emergency?" Danny could barely speak through the terror. "There's someone at the gas station. He's not normal. I need help." The operator's voice was calm but firm. "Stay on the line, sir. The police are on the way." As Danny pressed his back against the office wall, he peeked through the small window, watching the parking lot. But the man was gone. No trace, no footprints, no sign of him outside. A minute passed. Then, 2. Suddenly the doorbell chimed again. Danny's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't bring himself to look out, couldn't bring himself to check. He stayed frozen, his phone trembling in his hand. A few minutes later, the sirens wailed in the distance. When the police arrived, they searched the station, checked the cameras, but found nothing unusual. No signs of the man, no strange activity, just Danny, shaken alone. Later, when Danny was ready to leave for the night, he made his way out to the parking lot, still feeling the tightness in his chest. As he passed the pump, he noticed something strange on the ground, a single white feather. Danny bent down to pick it up, and when he turned it over, he saw a small message scrawled in what looked like dark ink. "I'll be waiting again." And that night, when Danny locked up the gas station and drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the dark corners of the city, those watchful eyes were still waiting.
The last customer. To close it was just after 2:30 a.m. when Casey took her usual seat behind the counter at the small, run-down gas station on the outskirts of town. The night was silent, except for the occasional hum of the fridges in the back and the faint buzz of the neon sign flickering in the window. She'd worked third shifts before, but tonight felt different, heavier somehow. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't shake, a quiet unease creeping in on her. The fog outside was thick, swallowing up the streetlights and creating an eerie atmosphere around the station. The night felt endless. Casey sighed, reaching for her coffee cup, when the door chime rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced up. A man stood in the doorway wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his face hidden in shadow. His presence seemed to suck the warmth out of the room, leaving a chill in the air. He didn't speak, didn't move. "Can I help you?" Casey asked, trying to mask the unease creeping up her spine. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the floor, unmoving. "Sir?" Casey tried again, her voice shaky. "We're not open for long. Just letting you know." Still no response. He simply stood there like a statue, as if waiting for something. Casey's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. She wasn't sure what was wrong, but something was definitely off. She glanced at the security camera above the counter. Static. The screen was fuzzy, like the camera was malfunctioning. She swallowed hard. "Sir?" she said again, her voice firmer this time. "You're gonna need to leave if you're not buying anything." Without a word, the man moved. It was slow, deliberate, like he was savoring every step. He approached the counter, and Casey felt her heart rate spike. As he reached the counter, he placed a small, folded piece of paper in front of her. Casey stared at it for a moment before slowly picking it up. The paper was old, yellowed, and creased from being folded too many times. She unfolded it, her fingers trembling as she read the hastily written note. "I know you're alone." Her heart dropped to her stomach. The words felt like they were echoing in her mind. Who was this person? What did they want? She looked up from the note, but the man was gone. There was no sound, no door chime, no footsteps, just silence. Confused and terrified, Casey rushed to the door and looked outside. The parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man anywhere. Her breathing quickened as she turned back to the counter. The note was still there, but now there was something else. A small, cracked photo, face down. Her hands shook as she picked it up, flipping it over. The picture was grainy, but it was unmistakable. It was a photo of the station, her station, the very one she was working in. But the photo was taken from the parking lot, looking in through the front window. The photo was recent, showing her at the counter, just like she was now. Her heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't noticed anyone outside. She hadn't seen a car. How long had he been watching? Casey's stomach churned as she looked around the station, her pulse racing. The air felt suffocating now, and her mind was racing with fear. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Just then, the lights flickered above her, then went out completely. The station was plunged into darkness. "Hello?" Casey whispered, her voice shaking. She reached for the phone and stopped. A soft, scraping sound coming from the back of the store. Slowly, she stood, her legs trembling as she moved toward the back. Every step felt like an eternity. "Hello?" she called out again, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached the storage room door, her hand hovering over the handle. The scraping sound grew louder. It was coming from inside. Without thinking, Casey flung the door open. Nothing. The room was empty, shelves filled with cleaning supplies and boxes. But then she saw something strange, footprints, wet and muddy, leading toward the back exit. Her pulse quickened. The door to the back alley was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. And then, the lights flickered back on. The buzzing returned. Casey took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked around, frantic. The store was silent again, but there on the counter was the photo, the same one. This time, however, there was something else in the image. A figure stood at the window, staring directly at her, and it was wearing a hat. The customer from hell. It was just past 2 a.m. when Rachel sat at the counter of the small, isolated gas station on the edge of town. The flickering neon sign outside cast a weak, eerie light over the empty parking lot. It had been a slow night, too quiet, even for third shift, and the heavy fog rolling in only added to the sense of unease hanging in the air. Rachel glanced at the clock. Only a few more hours until she could clock out and head home. She let out a sigh, staring out the window, half dreading the long night ahead. Suddenly, the door chimed, pulling her from her thoughts. A man stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the foggy night outside. His face was shadowed, hidden under a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat. He didn't speak, just stood there, staring at the floor. Rachel frowned, her nerves tightening. Most of her customers were regulars, but this man, something about him felt wrong. She cleared her throat, trying to mask her unease. "Can I help you?" she asked, forcing a smile. The man didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He just stood there, unmoving. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. "Sir?" she asked again, her voice a little shakier this time. "You need gas, or—" Still, he said nothing. Rachel's stomach knotted. She glanced at the clock again. It was almost 3 a.m., and the gas station was dead silent except for the hum of the refrigerators behind her. This wasn't normal. "Sir?" Rachel said again, more firmly. "You can't just stand there." Finally, after a long, drawn-out pause, the man took a single step forward. Slowly, he pulled something from his coat pocket, a small folded piece of paper. He slid it across the counter toward her, never making eye contact. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. Rachel's heart thudded in her chest. He stared at the The man was gone before she could say anything more. The door chimed as it closed behind him, but when Rachel looked outside, there was no sign of him. Confused, she unfolded the note. It was scrawled in uneven handwriting, smeared in places, like it had been written in a hurry. "I know you're alone. You can't hide from me." Rachel's blood ran cold. Her hands shook as she read the words again, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Who was this? She looked around the store, her breath quickening. The security cameras above the counter flickered, static filling the screen. What the hell? Rachel grabbed her phone and tried to dial 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was dead. Panic began to rise in her chest as she looked out the window. The parking lot was empty, no sign of the man. No cars, no lights, just the oppressive fog rolling in. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Maybe it was a prank, she thought. Maybe just some random person trying to scare her. But then the lights above her flickered. The hum of the station's old fluorescent bulbs stuttered, and for a moment, everything went completely dark. Her heart skipped a beat. The darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides. She fumbled for the flashlight under the counter, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Just then, the lights flickered back on, and that's when she saw it. On the counter, next to the note, was a picture. A faded, face down. Rachel's breath caught as she reached for it, her hands trembling more with each second. She flipped the photo over. It was a picture of the gas station. The picture was old, but it was unmistakable. There was the counter, the shelves, and in the background, a figure standing by the door. Her. The photo had been man taken from outside the station through the foggy window. Rachel's stomach dropped. How had he gotten that? How long had he been watching? Her eyes darted to the window again. The parking lot was empty. The station was silent. Yet something inside her screamed that she wasn't alone. Then she heard it. A faint, muffled scraping sound coming from the back of the store. Slowly, she turned her head toward the storage room door, her breath catching in her throat. It was barely audible, but it was there. Someone was moving inside. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she took a step back. Her feet felt glued to the floor. Slowly, she crept toward the back room, every step heavy, every creak of the floorboards sounding louder than before. Then, from the back room, came the unmistakable sound of the door opening. Click, the back door. Rachel froze. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The scraping sound stopped. Silence filled the room. And in that silence, Rachel heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice, soft and clear. I know you're still here. The door behind her slammed open, and then nothing.
The last customer. It was 2:45 a.m., and Jenna was alone at the gas station. The highway was eerily quiet, save for the occasional hum of the neon sign buzzing above. She was used to the slow nights. The graveyard shift always dragged on. But tonight, something felt different. A strange unease crept up her spine, and she couldn't shake it. The silence was thick when the door chime suddenly rang. Jenna looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, his face hidden by a hood and scarf. His hands were stuffed deep in his coat pockets. "Hi," Jenna said, forcing a smile. "Can I help you?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at her, unmoving. You need gas or something?" she asked, a hint of nervousness creeping into her voice. The man still didn't answer. Something about him felt wrong. Jenna glanced around the station, but the parking lot was empty. The guy didn't seem like a threat, but the way he was staring at her made her feel uneasy. "Look, I need to close soon," she said, trying again. "Can you tell me what you need?" The man finally took a slow step forward and placed a crumpled $20 bill on the counter. His eyes never left her face, and his gaze was unsettlingly intense. Jenna took the money, trying to maintain some composure. "You're good to go after this," she said, her voice shaky. "No other purchases?" He nodded silently, still standing unnervingly still. She bagged the change and handed it to him, but as he reached out, his sleeve brushed against her hand, ice cold. Jenna recoiled instinctively, her skin prickling. The man didn't seem to notice or care. He simply turned, walked toward the door, and stepped outside, leaving the bell above the door to chime softly. Relieved, Jenna glanced at the clock, still 2:50 a.m. She took a deep breath and returned to her paperwork. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. She glanced up at the security camera feed on the wall. The screen was filled with static. "Great," Jenna muttered to herself, standing up to check the camera. But as she walked toward the back, something caught her eye. The man was back, standing just outside the glass doors, staring at her again. Her pulse spiked. How had he gotten back so fast? She hadn't even seen him leave the parking lot. She took a step closer to the window, trying to get a better look. But as soon as she did, the man turned and disappeared into the fog. The mist outside was thick enough that she couldn't see a thing beyond the station. Feeling a wave of dread wash over her, Jenna turned back toward the counter. Then she froze. There, lying on the counter, was the crumpled $20 bill the man had given her. She hadn't even realized she'd given it back to him. Her heart skipped a beat. The phone on the counter suddenly rang. Jenna's hand trembled as she reached for the receiver, her breath shallow. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end for a long moment, before a voice came through, low and distorted, like a whisper traveling through a long tunnel. "You're not alone." Jenna's blood turned to ice. The phone line clicked, and the call ended abruptly. Jenna looked around the store, her mind racing. The door had locked when the man left, and there were no other customers in sight. She turned to the security camera feed again, hoping to get some comfort in seeing the lot empty. But the screen flickered, and then, there, just outside the window, was the man. His face was now visible in the reflection of the glass, his eyes black, his mouth twisted into an eerie grin. Jenna spun around, but the station was completely empty. No one was there. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "I'm still watching." Terror coursed through her as she glanced at the window one last time, and this time, the man was inside. The shadow in the aisles, it was 2:30 a.m., and Marissa was finishing up her shift at the lonely, 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of town. The night was silent, except for the occasional hum of the pumps and the flickering neon lights. She'd grown used to the slow, lonely hours, but tonight felt different, unsettling even. The thick fog outside pressed against the windows, blurring the world beyond. She was zoning out when the door chime rang, jerking her back to attention. A man walked in, his face hidden under the brim of a worn-out baseball cap, and the collar of his jacket turned up. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he was trying to avoid drawing attention. "Hi," Marissa said, forcing a smile. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't respond. He just walked past her, his heavy boots making soft echoes on the tile floor. Marissa's nerves prickled. He didn't go straight for the counter or the snack aisle, like most customers did. Instead, he wandered toward the back of the store, where the restrooms and the storage shelves were. Her heart raced. It wasn't unusual for people to use the bathroom, but this man felt off. His movements too slow, his posture too stiff. She could see him in the reflection of the glass door, standing at the back of the store, his body angled toward her like he was waiting for something. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice wavered. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned slightly and glanced at her over his shoulder, his eyes dark and empty. For a split second, their eyes met, and a chill ran down her spine. His stare was cold, devoid of any emotion. Her hand instinctively reached for the phone on the counter. She'd worked enough late shifts to know when something didn't feel right, and this was definitely one of those times. Just then, the lights flickered. The whole station seemed to shudder, and the hum of the refrigerator behind her died down. A wave of dread flooded Marissa's chest. She glanced back at the man. He was no longer standing by the back shelves. In fact, he was gone. Her heart skipped a beat. She'd seen him clearly just a moment ago. There was no way he could have disappeared that quickly. She spun around to check the store, but the aisles were still empty. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking. No answer. Then, the door to the bathroom creaked open. Marissa's blood ran cold. The man stepped out, but this time, he wasn't walking. He was moving toward her at a staggering pace, like something inhuman. His arms extended unnaturally. His face was no longer hidden by the cap. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his mouth slack in an unsettling grin. Before Marissa could react, he lunged. He grabbed her wrist with a vice-like grip, dragging her toward the back of the store. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the silence of the empty station. Her heart pounded as she fought to break free, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong, his grip tightening around her wrist like steel. "Let me go," she shouted, trying to pull away, but his strength was terrifying, and her limbs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. With one brutal yank, he pulled her into the storage room behind the counter. It was pitch black inside, the door slamming shut behind them. She heard his breathing, slow, ragged, like he was savoring the moment. Marissa's pulse hammered in her ears as she struggled to get a grip on her phone, fumbling with it in the dark. She needed to call for help, but the man's grip only tightened with every movement she made. Then, out of nowhere, she heard a loud crash from the front of the store. The door to the gas station slammed open. The man froze. A voice, distant but growing louder, echoed from the entrance. "Police! Freeze! Let her go!" Marissa felt a cold surge of relief, but her thoughts were racing. She had no idea who was coming to her rescue or how they found her, but the sound of footsteps growing closer to the back room made her hope they were real. The man hesitated, his grip loosening for just a moment. That was all it took. Marissa shoved him away, scrambling toward the back door. She reached for the handle, but just as she pulled it open, she heard him whisper from behind her, "You can't escape." She froze. The door flew open, and as she bolted outside, the fog swallowed her, blurring the gas station behind her. She never saw the man again, but she never went back to that gas station either. Not after what she learned. The police found the security footage later. When they reviewed the tapes, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. The man had never entered the store. He'd been watching her from the outside the whole time,